So, Chapter 10, Part 3, Romanesque Art. I told you this was going to be quite different. There's a nice little picture there just to give you a sense of how different it's going to be. So there's some very big ideas, and I'm going to try very hard to communicate what's going on in Europe at this time. During the 11th century, people began to move from agricultural villages to burgeoning urban areas. Technology and ideas from Byzantine and Islamic cultures led society into a period of intellectual and artistic development. Romanesque is considered the first trans-European artistic movement. The Christian religion morphs dramatically at this time, with greater emphasis on impending judgment and the possibility of purgatory or hell. The Catholic Church grew ever larger, richer, and more powerful. The cult of saints is key to understanding the pilgrimage phenomenon that grew exponentially in these early centuries. So by cult of saints, when we looked at old St. Peter's, I explained how Peter's grave was underneath the transept down in a crypt, and that pilgrims would enter the church and want to get close to Peter's grave and touch his sarcophagus because they believed that there was some benefit to them, almost like there was some magic inherent in the physical body of Peter. So this gradually grows into a cult of saints and a cult of relics, where it's widespread belief over all of Europe that this is true. This is the way of the world. It was designed by God. And this is mostly due to the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. And also the belief in purgatory was a teaching of the Catholic Church. So one popular way to buy one's way out of purgatory was to go on a pilgrimage to a site where one could visit with a saint via their relics. So you could also pray to them if you were close to their relics, and they would hear you because you were so close to their bones. Among the most popular sites were Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome, and the Holy Land, but there were many local saints and shrines all over Europe. Any place where someone died for their faith, there would likely be a pilgrimage church and something growing up there. Purgatory was like a waiting room. I'm not sure if the Catholics still believe in purgatory, but if everybody dies, right, and when you die, the Christians generally believe that if you're a good person, you go to heaven. If you're not a good person, if you're a murderer or a thief, you would go to hell. But the Catholic Church created an in-between place called purgatory. And I should point out that when I say they created it, I mean that there's no mention of purgatory in the Bible at all. So this dogma of purgatory held people in this limbo land where they're not good enough for heaven, they're not bad enough for hell, they have to wait. And people who are still living, like their children and their grandchildren, can do things to get them out of purgatory and into heaven. They can say prayers for them, they can give gifts to the church, and each person's time in purgatory it's kind of like karma. Like depending on what you did in your life, your sentence in purgatory could be short or long. And the dogma of the church provided many ways that you could shorten your sentence. And one was to go on a pilgrimage. This was a physical act, something you could do. You could also pay for art to go into churches. You could commission sculptures or paintings for churches. You could pay for the buildings of churches. You could give money to monasteries. You could do a lot of things to help get credit for your way out of purgatory. So yeah, it sounds a lot like karma, doesn't it? But the goal is heaven. The goal is, yeah, which is kind of like nirvana. Okay, they're very similar. So the name Romanesque itself gives away the big idea. It's Roman-like or Romanesque. Get it? And one of the big ideas in Roman art was the arch. So we can use that as a starting point in Romanesque. So here's the Roman arch, the Arch of Constantine here. And over here is a Romanesque church showing these round arches on the facade of the church. Also, like Roman architecture, Romanesque architecture is stone. It is heavy. It is not necessarily very vertical, but vertical elements will start appearing. Windows are very small because it's all heavy, heavy stonework. So now I've explained pilgrimage, more or less. So pilgrims who go on pilgrimage trails that was a long trip across Europe. They would make many stops. Every little church along the way, every town along the way of the pilgrimage route would try to have something there for the pilgrims, a local saint or a church or something for them to do. And it also revolves a lot around an economy, that the pilgrims would put money in offering boxes, and everybody wanted that pilgrim money as well. So one of the goals of the pilgrims, maybe the most popular one, was this place in Spain, Santiago de Compostela. And it is there because the people believed that St. James, who was one of the disciples of Jesus, had made his way to Spain and had died there, and his body was found much later in a field in Spain, and the person who found it received a vision that told him it was the bones of James. So this became a miracle. And the bones of James were placed in this church, and it became a site where people could visit and pray to James, who was in heaven, and could relate their prayers directly to Jesus. So all the pilgrims coming into churches dictated a change in the style of churches to accommodate pilgrims. So they're taking a page from Old St. Peter's with the side aisles and the transept, but there's more. So increasing congregations and throngs of pilgrims prompted larger interior spaces and increased number of shrines. The Church of Santiago de Compostela features both barrel and half-barrel vaults and an octagonal lantern. Its principal relic was the body of St. James, the miraculous body that found its way to Spain, and compound piers appear on columns. So this is the plan of it. So I said that there's like multiple shrines in here, and even though the main shrine, I'm assuming right here at the apex of the apse would be the actual relics of St. James. But you can see there's like 1, 2, 3, 4 other chapels before you get to that, and 4 after that. Each one of these little chapels would have had something in there, a relic of a saint or a picture, an artwork, or something. So the idea was the pilgrims, after their long journey, would enter the church. We'll talk about what they saw as they entered a pilgrimage church in a little bit. And they would walk around the outside. There would be a long string of people, so it's a long queue. And they would stop here and they would pray to whatever was in this shrine, and they would drop a coin in an offering box. They'd come to the next one, pray and drop a coin, pray and drop a coin, pray and drop. Okay, you get the picture? So there's a lot of coin dropping and a lot of praying going on. And then they'd come out, and at some point, I'm not sure where it occurred at Santiago, they would get a certificate signed by the Bishop of Santiago that guaranteed them some huge number of years off of purgatory, something like 20,000 years, because purgatory was very, very long. I'm just looking in my notes to see if I ever put down a number for how many years you got off. No, I don't think so. But just trust me, it was thousands. So if you went on the pilgrimage to Santiago, it was worth it, because man, you wouldn't want to spend more time in purgatory than was absolutely necessary. And here's a reconstruction of the exterior, because the church is still standing, but it's been remodeled many times and does not look like this anymore. It looks like a big Baroque church. But here you can see the transept of the church, the nave, the octagonal lantern tower over the crossing, and all these little chapels where people would stop and pray and drop a coin. Okay, so let's move on. This is the interior of it now. So this is the barrel vaulting that I told you about. Typical of the Romanesque is the barrel vaulting. So Romanesque is either going to have a flat ceiling or be barrel vaulted. Occasional groin vaulting, we may see some of that. It's very dark in the side aisles because the windows are super small. All of the weight of the stone roof and the vaulting falls down on the walls, so it has to be super strong. And that's what all this darkness is around the outside. Those are big supportive piers and buttresses. And down there somewhere, the bones of St. James. So I told you about all those little chapels where people would stop and pray, and sometimes it was in artwork. I'll show you some of that much later, but often it was a relic, and there's a great market for relics. So there was trade. If people had a body of a martyr in their churchyard, they might dig it up and put it in a reliquary, but before they did that, they might remove some pieces and sell them to churches, for neighboring churches, for money, so that those churches could also have a part of those saints. And it's become one of my morbid obsessions to locate body part reliquaries in art museums. So here's just a small smattering of those. This one obviously held some bone from a saint's foot. These three here had either arm or hand bones in them. This reliquary here held a skull. And this one over here that looks like a little golden doll covered with jewels, that also held the skull of a saint, a young girl martyr. So this is the sort of thing that would be in those chapels, and it would facilitate prayer. So pilgrims could talk directly to the saint whose bones were in these. I hope you're getting the picture of just how odd this was. But it was a very big deal, and nobody questioned it. Everybody in Europe swallowed this, hook, line, and sinker. So here is the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. She became much more popular during the age of pilgrimage. Figures like this, where Mary represents the throne of wisdom, might also have been venerated in the chapels of pilgrimage churches. So I said an artwork could have been there. So putting an image of the Virgin Mary in there was not unknown. What I don't think we see much of, we don't see crucifixes, we don't see crucifixions, but we are talking to saints, so that's what we see. And the throne of wisdom is the iconography of Mary serving as the chair for Jesus. And the subtext here is that when Jesus grows up and becomes an adult, he goes around and teaches a lot. And this is the text of the 4 gospel books, is the ministry of Jesus. So this is explaining where he gets all that wisdom. He didn't get it from this sort of connection with God. He got it from his mother, who's responsible for his education and his upbringing. She is the source of his wisdom, the throne of wisdom. Interesting, huh? So here's a Romanesque structure that looks quite different from the one I just showed you in Spain. And this is in Italy, and it's the cathedral at Pisa. And it's an entire campus with lots of structures. Over here behind this wall is the Camposanto, or the cemetery. And this is the baptistry. It's, in this case, it's round, but this is where people would be baptized. So in Italy, all of the component parts of a cathedral or a church are separate structures. It's not like this in other parts of Europe. So people who are not baptized could not enter the church until they had been baptized. So they would have to go through the initiation ceremony first, and then they could come in. And this is the church, and this is the campanile, or the bell tower. So I'm asking you which building here is leaning, and the answer is not the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but it is the campanile, or the bell tower. So bells would have been placed up here in the top, and people would ring the bells, and they could be heard all over the city. So that's why it's tall, for audibility. So the style of buildings here in this part of northern Italy are white stone with a lot of sort of lacy looking elements, but it's very Romanesque. And this is a basilica. There's your clerestory windows and your side aisles and your transept and a little dome over the crossing. So you can see that. And here are the labels. So the cathedral was part of a complex that also contained circular baptistry, campanile, which became famous as the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the Camposanto, the cathedral, and the campanile. I just told you about all those. So it's a quiz question. You need to know that bell tower is the word campanile. Campanile. Let's go to England. So that was one little glimpse at Italy. There was a lot of Romanesque architecture and art in Italy. Let's go look at some architecture up in England. And this is the church in Durham, in the very north of England. So this is an important little blurb here. Following the Norman invasion of England in 1066, when William the Conqueror and his nobles set about gaining and maintaining control of the entire island, many castles and cathedrals were built. In the far north, that's a typo. Forget that. That's hilarious. In the far north, Durham architects developed a system of building using columnar piers carved with zigzagging chevrons, and thus created an entirely new form of architecture. God, there's a lot of typos in here. Please do not learn your spelling from these slides. Almost but not quite Gothic. So we look at this because of what's going on up here. Durham is Romanesque, and it's got these nice round arches down here, but the rib vaulting up here starts to look quite different. I've tried to black out the Gothic window down there because that was added later. The style was employed in the nave of the cathedral. The Romanesque groin vaulting technique was modified by applying two pairs of crisscrossing ribs within each bay and called ribbed groin vaulting. So just take my word for it. We're almost looking Gothic here, but not quite. So it's kind of proto-Gothic. So Durham, this is the map of the campus of Durham. This is the church, and we're looking this way. These are the big piers that alternate a single inscribed massive pier here or a bundled pier, and they just alternate with zigzag lines and checkered patterns. And attached to Durham, and I promised you I'd show you a real cathedral that was in a monastery, and it had those monastic buildings like we saw in the ideal monastery. So here's the cloister right up against the nave, and over here is the refectory, the kitchen, and over here is the dormitory of the monks where they would sleep, and so they would not come in close to the choir, but they would enter from the back. And this was a cemetery attached. So it's a beautiful little campus up in the north of England. Still standing, obviously. And this is a view from the crossing tower of Durham Cathedral looking down into the cloister. It was on a summer day, and so they had a tent set up in there, but this is just for a special occasion. So this again was the refectory or the dining room, and over here was the monks' dormitory, and there's the little kitchen back there. Around the cloister, we have what's called Norman Romanesque. So the round arches with all of these patterned courses through it and bundled piers. I mean, all of these have terms, but I'm just sort of wanting you to see it and look at it. And I can say that this building is so remarkable in its architecture. It's been used a lot, especially in Harry Potter films. I've spotted it in several of them. So here are the children talking to Hagrid out in this very cloister. There's Professor Snape walking toward that very door that I showed you. So this is Durham Cathedral in England. That will be a quiz question as well. Now, I promised you when we looked at Santiago and Compostela that I would show you the kind of artwork that greeted the pilgrims. So they're coming in off the road. They've been walking. It's all sort of foot traffic. And the churches along the pilgrimage route would create this special iconography to welcome pilgrims in. So sculptors carved speaking facades on Romanesque churches. Christian messages are displayed in public spaces. At Saint-Pierre in Moissac in France, a powerful image of Christ in majesty dominates the tympanum. This is called a tympanum, and it's like a timpani drum. So it's like a drum, it's a half drum. Foliate and geometric ornament covers the area. This is the diagram of all of these parts. I have X'd these out to say you don't need to know those for the quiz. You don't need to know jam, trumeau, or voussoirs, or archivolts, but you do need to know tympanum. And look, lintel you don't need to know either. So I'm giving you a big gift. And just one vocabulary word. I think you can handle that. So here's another tympanum. This one's a little bit more interesting because this is more typical of what was shown on the portals, the portal tympana of Romanesque churches, pilgrimage churches. The west portal of the Church of Saint Lazare at Autun shows a monumental Christ in a body halo, which is his mandorla here. This is Jesus in the middle. He's flanked by angels. Kind of hard to read, take my word for it. In a scene of last judgment, that's what's typical. Jesus as judging people's souls. The scene is filled with human interest, the message of which being that those who live in sin will face damnation. It's a warning. This is what drove people onto the pilgrimage road, was this fear of the demons, of living in hell. So there's Jesus flanked by his angels. There's angels over here sort of singing and praising him in heaven. I interpret this long register down here as being a purgatory of the waiting room. And here's a pair of hands that pull up this poor little person's head, and he's weighed up above. So there's a set of scales. There's devils on one side. There's an angel on one side trying to save that soul. So I think this is the purgatory. Then people are pulled out of purgatory and weighed, and then your fate is cast. You either have to go to hell or you get to go to heaven. And aren't you glad you came on this pilgrimage so that the chances are much better that you will end up in heaven? Here's a close-up showing that scene of judgment, the scales, all these little naked people are souls. This is iconography of the Middle Ages, that souls are represented as little nude people because you don't take anything with you in this belief system. And there's those scary hands grabbing that poor little guy. Look at the scary devils. Oh my gosh. You don't want that happening. But an angel might pull you out and save you if you're good. Some more Romanesque sculpture, the architectural sculpture and painting. It starts to evolve, and it shows a lot of scary stuff, but it also shows images that instruct and enlighten. So most people are illiterate. They cannot read, so they hear the priest give the messages in church, and then they can see those messages often illustrated. They can recognize images. So here's Mary with baby Jesus on the flight to Egypt following his birth at Christmas. And over here you've got, I'm sorry again, God the Father creating Adam, creating Eve out of the side of Adam, and Adam and Eve being tempted by the serpent in the garden. So this is almost the only time other than the souls, that we're really going to see nude humans in Romanesque art is in the story of Adam and Eve, because it was part of their narrative. Now let's look at something secular for a change. So I know you think it's all about heaven and hell, and it largely was, but there was other stuff going on too. So some secular art. This is manuscripts, textiles, and wood carvings. Artists in the 11th and 12th centuries were often monks and nuns, although secular urban workshops supplied textiles, tableware, books, and weapons. The Bayeux embroidery is a surviving example of needlework. Embroidery consists of stitches applied on top of an already woven fabric. So this is part of the Bayeux embroidery. And this vignette shows Bishop Odo blessing the feast. It is Norman Anglo-Saxon embroidery. The whole embroidery is 229 feet long, so it's one really long strip of fabric, and it narrates the story, scene after scene after scene, of how William the Conqueror was given no alternative but to bring his army over to England and to take over that country. It's very interesting. So there's little scenes of showing all these little vignettes, people feasting at a table, people under a structure here. There are always words in Latin to explain what it is you're seeing. It looks like people over here are cooking something on a fire. And then there are little border figures of animals and sometimes people doing strange things. This one is one that I hope you will enjoy. This is one of the vignettes. It shows King Harold, who was the King of England, who was defeated by William the Conqueror. And up in the upper border, we have Isti mirant stella. They see here the star. So this documents the appearance of Halley's Comet, which occurred right around the time of the Norman invasion of England. And these men in this building, or outside of this building, are looking up and pointing to the star because it was interpreted as an omen. And just exactly what it was an omen for, people could interpret that anyway. It's an omen that what? William has to go to England? What? Harold should give up the throne? You know, I don't know. There's so many different ways, but it did happen about the time of the Norman invasion. And then at the very end of this are 7 slides I usually don't even talk about, so you get a buy on this. Lucky you. They're on the PDF if you want to see those slides, but I'm ignoring them today. And that brings us to the end of the Romanesque. I hope you got the big idea. It's really dominated by the idea of pilgrimage, which itself is dominated by the fear of hell. And people just not feeling that they are worthy of heaven, that they can get to heaven without doing something, without earning their way there somehow.